Two things motivate the Hague Group: the end of impunity and the defense of humanity. We look at history. We look at why and how the South African apartheid regime fell, and we know that it was collective action, not just from people's organizations, but a real united action from people's groups and from states together. When South Africa brought its historic Genocide Convention case to the ICJ in January of last year, which many of you remember, it was this moment where finally, after 3 months of lies and lies being repeated from the halls of the White House by Biden to every single media channel in the world, it really felt like in the hall of the top court. Finally, now that the truth was out there, the statistics and the videos that we had been seeing live streamed to our phones finally being displayed on this court meant that it would come to a stop, that the world would come to a stop and Netanyahu would be able to be stopped. But I remember Netanyahu coming out just 2 days after the hearing to hold a press conference and declaring, nobody can stop us, not even The Hague. And it's incredible to watch how prescient those words have been and how true, unfortunately, that they've turned out to be, that despite all of these actions from different governments and especially unions and civil society around the world, we've not been able to really materially cut off the arteries of the genocidal machine. That's why the Hague Group was launched. It was launched out of necessity, or put in another way, it should not have been launched. Our existing legal institutions, our existing multilateral institutions, our existing state obligations under international law should have sufficed to stop this genocide as soon as the evidence was in of Israel's assault and attacks against the Palestinian people. Yet we see that it has not stopped today, day 105-63 of the genocide. So the Hague Group, now brought together by 8 nations, Bolivia, Cuba, Colombia, Honduras, Malaysia, Namibia, and Senegal, a tricontinental bloc from Asia, Africa, and Latin America, is a coalition that's committed to taking decisive, coordinated action in pursuit of accountability for Israel's crimes. So what is it that motivates the Hague Group? Two things motivate the Hague Group: the end of impunity and the defense of humanity. The reason I say that is because the implications of what it means to let our entire international legal institutions die and the multilateral institutions completely submit themselves to a handful of powerful nations has ramifications well beyond what's happening right now in Palestine alone. It is the breakdown of the entire international legal architecture and really the moral architecture that keeps us together as nations and peoples of the world. So there are 3 inaugural measures that have been announced by the Hague Group when it was launched in January 31st, 2025. The 3 are quite simple. The first is to respect the ICC warrants issued against Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant in the cases of state parties to the Rome Statute, and to fulfill the obligations of prosecution and persecution which exist even to those not party to the Rome Statute under the International Court of Justice's advisory opinion in the case of non-state parties. The second is to prevent provision or transfer of arms, munitions, and any related military equipment to Israel from their factories, from their countries. And third is to prevent the docking of vessels at any port, wherever applicable, of course, for countries that do have ports within their territorial jurisdiction, in all cases where there's a clear risk of the vessel being used to carry military fuel and weaponry to Israel. In some ways, I think we can all agree that the Hague Group might seem radical to many. It seems like it requires governments of courage. It requires presidents willing to take on Trump, willing to take on sanctions and visa revocations and so on and so forth. But in many other ways, I think the 3 measures that we're discussing today are boring, are in a way really the minimal requirements that we would expect of states. I remember that in one of our early negotiations, one of the ambassadors, I believe it was the Bolivian ambassador, who said, these are simply put, already our obligations under international law. Why should we come out and form yet another coalition and repeat ourselves on the international stage? The reason we're having to do that we're acting really in this moment of profound failure where every single institution that we have built so far that should have safeguarded Palestinians against the genocide today have completely and utterly failed. That's the world we live in today, where the sacred is no longer sacred, where what we thought was obvious is no longer obvious, especially if you look at a handful of countries, European countries and those from the global north, openly, brazenly challenging in many different forms, whether it's France with Macron making up rules about immunity for heads of state, whether it's Hungary and Poland openly simply saying we're not going to respect the jurisdiction of the ICC, or countries like Switzerland who've given up their traditional neutrality to actually fall on the wrong side of history here. So in the face of these kind of assaults, and as they escalate with Trump in office in the United States, issuing sanctions against every single staffer of the ICC and now threatening every government official that works through Palestinian solidarity with sanctions and with visa revocations once again. We've just seen today, this morning, that Gustavo Petro, the president of Colombia, has had his visa revoked by the United States, one of the greatest champions, and again, a member of the Hague Group. This is not surprising to us. It is precisely because of the recognition of these kind of assaults that the Hague Group was formed. So for us, it's very clear that the motivation is for it to be material. It is not about a communications group. It is not, once again, about making these grand statements, but about enforcing state policy at the national level in a coordinated fashion across all of these countries to ensure that we finally cut off every line of economic support that feeds the machine in Israel. That means announcing and enforcing that our people, our factories and our ports will not be used, will not have blood on their hands, and will refuse to be complicit in the genocide against the Palestinians. The second key kind of almost creative element of this group, I would say, is that of coordination. Many on this call know how difficult it is to actually be able to chart out every single ship that is carrying supplies, sometimes for governments in their own countries, because this is how Israel operates. They operate through a various number of disguises. They operate through multiple shell companies with constantly changing masks and names. So what you do require, if you were to continually block off an entire route from carrying arms, is for there to be a coordinated infrastructure, is for there to be coordinated technologies. The key challenges for us, of course, remain unilateral punishment. We've seen this multiple times well before the Hague Group was even formed. We saw this with countries like Spain when they tried to issue an arms embargo, where they've been hit with fines up to $2.5 billion per voyage by using trade laws. So from using aid as coercion, which is what they've done in the case of South Africa, for example, by cutting off US aid and threatening it, all sorts of expulsions from multiple treaties, using the trade fines as they've done in the case of Spain, or of course, much more open sanctions as they've done against the ICC, and now with visa revocations and personal attacks, as we've seen in the case of Gustavo Petro, the president of Colombia, as of this morning. But we really are of the belief that the only antidote to this logic of unilateral punishment from powerful countries against a few of the small countries that have come together to form this Hague Group is for the group to grow, is for the group to become a collective that cannot be punished as a whole, or if the handful of powerful countries continue to act in this punishing logic, will find that they isolate themselves when the Hague Group becomes not just 8, but 8 from 18 and 18 to 80. One last note that I'd like to say before I wrap up is the reason we believe in this collective action model is because we look at history. We look at why and how the South African apartheid regime fell, and we know that it was collective action, not just from people's organizations, but a real united action from people's groups and from states together, whether you're looking at the Lusaka Manifesto of 1963 that brought together African liberation movements to come together to say, actually, in every single country here, our liberation is linked to the fall of the South African apartheid regime that then travels, goes to the United Nations and turns into a real Security Council resolution, an arms embargo against the apartheid regime, which then travels even further to New Delhi into the International Conference Against Apartheid that builds a real global South bloc of nations, all once again doing exactly what the Hague Group has done, which is at the national level enforcing state policy to be in line, to be in solidarity with the liberation movement in apartheid South African regime to finally have that final straw that breaks the apartheid regime's back. I say this as someone from India whose own government is extremely complicit in the genocide today. The years of 1947 and 48 are critical for us. Just as India awoke to life and freedom and to our independence in 47, we saw our siblings in Palestine with the Nakba in 48 and with the apartheid regime being formalized and 750,000 people displaced in Palestine once again in 48. And we've always grown up with this idea that India would not be free. And in fact, it's what all of our freedom fighters and the leaders of the liberation movement said, that India would not be free until South Africa was free and until Palestine was free. And it's really a shame to watch so many global South governments themselves make a U-turn on this position, partly out of fear, partly out of domestic considerations. But the Hague Group, I hope, is putting that third world solidarity back on the block and showing that it is only collective action that can save not just the current genocide from continuing, but really all of us and the rest of our country's morality on this world stage today.